It's very good to have you all here. We are going to try to get right to the substance. But before we do that, we're going to have a welcome from Dean Diane Ring of Boston College Law School. So I'll introduce Dean Ring now. Then she will give some her welcome. Then myself and the other co-organizers will say welcome and give you a few logistics for the day. And then we will go right to Professor Huang's opening address, to which I greatly look forward. So Diane Ring is Interim Dean, Professor of Law, and the Dr. Thomas F. Carney Distinguished Scholar at Boston College Law School. She served as Associate Dean of Faculty from 2018 to 2021. She researches and writes primarily in the field of international taxation, corporate taxation, and ethical issues in tax practice. Dean Ring was a consultant for the United Nations 2014 project on tax-based protection for developing countries and its 2013 project on treaty administration for developing countries. She was the U.S. National Reporter for the 2012 IFA conference on the debt equity conundrum. On the debt equity conundrum, and 2004 IFA conference on double non-taxation. Dean Ring is co-author of 3 casebooks on taxation. Prior to joining us here at BC, she held faculty appointments at the University of Florida Levin College of Law and Harvard Law School. Before entering academia, Dean Ring practiced at Kaplan and Drysdale in Washington, D.C., specializing in international tax and the taxation of financial instruments. She also clerked for Judge John O. Newman of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. During her time, when we've been fortunate to have her as interim dean, she's overseen the hiring of new faculty, launched 2 new faculty awards to encourage and celebrate scholarly achievement, welcomed, I think repeatedly now, I think 2 times in a row, the largest last year, and again, one of the most diverse first-year classes in Boston College Law School history, increased funding for public interest law fellow foundation stipends, developed a strategy focused on improving rankings, always important, and overseeing the school's most recent ABA accreditation process. And so I'm very happy to introduce and turn it over to Dean Ring to welcome you to the conference. Thank you, Dean.
So that's very nice to hear. Thank you all for coming today. It is really my privilege to welcome you to our 5th annual International IP Summit. And I am, again, especially happy that we're here in person this year. We launched the program on innovation and entrepreneurship, or PI, at Boston College Law School in 2017. And our goal was to bring together people across disciplines and occupations to consider important issues in innovation and entrepreneurship. We also wanted to think about these issues in a global context. This annual summit has become one significant way in which we accomplish these goals. And I thank Ropes and Gray for the fruitful partnership we've developed as co-sponsors of this event each year. Now, BC Law launched PI not simply because there's a large and growing need for legal services around innovation and entrepreneurship. We launched PI because innovation, entrepreneurship, small businesses, and startups are crucial contributors to economic growth and social mobility. In addition to PI, as part of our social justice mission, BC Law provides free legal services through our Entrepreneurship and Innovation Clinic, which is led by Professor Sandy Tarrant, and which particularly seeks to help entrepreneurs who lack some of the resources typical of many startup founders. Examples abound of the ways that innovation and creative production make our lives better. In nearly every area of life, we benefit from successive innovation and creativity that makes us healthier, safer, more productive, more comfortable, better educated, and more entertained. Perhaps that goes in the opposite direction. We have experienced so much astounding innovation, even within our lifetimes, that we risk taking it for granted, as if it naturally occurs. The reality, however, is that there are significant institutions and conditions required for widespread innovation. Some of these include capital markets, angel investors, venture capitalists, educational institutions, infrastructure, trade, regulation, and a culture of entrepreneurship. One critical institution that I have not yet mentioned in the list is rule of law, including specialized legal practices that facilitate the investment, research, development, acquisition, licensing, protection, and distribution of innovative products and services. Our innovation system could not function without a well-developed system of laws, as well as attorneys with deep expertise and specialization. This summit is an important way to further crucial legal evolutions and practice that make our innovation economy possible. By focusing on important developments and problems in IP law, your conversations will help strengthen and refine the crucial institutions on which we rely. Of course, innovation and business are no longer parochial concerns. Lawyers advising clients, government officials making and administering the law, and judges deciding cases increasingly must do so with knowledge of the institutions and the decisions being made in other countries. It is thus particularly appropriate that this summit grounds its considerations of IP law in international contexts with significant input from legal professionals from other countries. I have rightfully lauded the innovation and IP lawyers who make it possible. But our innovation economy is not without challenges. Innovation can bring people together and divide them. Powerful companies and platforms raise issues of political power, speech, and fairness. New technologies can raise ethical concerns, and the economic gains from innovation may not be equally shared. It is appropriate, therefore, to consider where laws and policies are working well and where they might be harmful. I commend you for addressing these questions in some of your panels today. The proper tailoring of IP law is an important part of shaping the society and the world in which we want to live. I'd like to thank our speakers for generously giving of their time and expertise. As I mentioned, they come from around the world. They come from academia, law firms, in-house, business, the Patent Office, the Federal Reserve, Capitol Hill, and the judiciary. With so many perspectives and so much expertise, I know that you will have fascinating and fruitful discussions. As I noted, this summit is made possible by a partnership between BC Law's Program on Innovation and Entrepreneurship and Ropes and Gray. And I want to thank some key people in both institutions for their work on this summit. The planning committee for the conference consisted of Regina Sampenti, partner at Ropes and Gray, Ed Kelly, BC Law class of '93, partner at Boston Galway, Bebe Sun, Senior Corporate Counsel, Sanofi, and BC Law's Faculty Director of PI, Professor David Olson. I know this, for all of you, has been a considerable investment of your valuable and, in some cases, billable time. Much appreciated. I'd also like to thank those who worked tirelessly today to make the entire event possible. And from Ropes and Gray in particular, Michelle Ahern, Lauren Codina, and Tierney Robertus, as well as the Ropes and Gray events team. Here at BC Law, I'd like to give special thanks to Nate Kenyon, Amanda Crowley, and Vicki Sanders for their work on logistics, material, promotion, and coverage of the summit. In conclusion, I warmly welcome you and wish you a most productive summit.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Now, one moment, I think the dean just took my notes. So we pride ourselves here at BC Law on not being the kind of culture where people are excessively competitive and cut pages out of the books in the library and whatnot. But as you maybe can tell, Dean Ring did not attend law school here, and so she stole my notes. But I got them. All right, so it's our great pleasure to host this again this year. We're so glad all of you are here, that you've come out, that we're in person. As Dean Ring said, when we started PI 5 years ago, we really wanted to focus and engage around innovation and entrepreneurship from both local and global perspectives. It was my great good fortune that at the same time, Regina Sampinti and Ed Kelly, who was then still at Ropes and Gray, were thinking along the same lines, and we came together and started this, and we're very happy to have kept it going virtually through the pandemic, and now again in person. So it's great to be here and to have this. And Regina and Ed, did you want to come up and be recognized? No, they want to keep the conversation. All right, so you'll get to hear from them as they are on panels and moderate later. So let me not stand in the way then of our first speaker. I'll just give you a few logistics. So the first of which, and good point, is that we're going to run things on time. It's very important. So for any panelists or speakers, if there's a certain ruthlessness to our timekeeping, it is an interest of running things on time. We are recording some of the sessions, and so you may be recorded. There's a microphone, so this is your warning under Massachusetts wiretapping laws. You have now been informed. If you have questions during the Q&A, we'll have 2 microphones, so please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you so that you can speak and be heard on the recording. We want this to be interactive, although our panelists will have a lot of expertise to bring, and the panels will be packed with content. We still hope to get in that Q&A period so it can be interactive and share ideas. Finally, if you have to come or go, and I know there's some students who have class schedules, while a panel is in session, if you can, and if it's easy to do so, you could kind of go through that back door. If you're over on this side of the room, it's hard to get to, then that one. I guess best just try not to cut across center stage, you know. All right, so that's it for logistics. It's now my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker. You'll hear me say this repeatedly, and it's similar to what I say to my students before a lot of classes. We've got something especially exciting coming up next. But I say that in class because I teach patent law and antitrust law, and it's all very exciting, so it's always true. And I'll say that about the panels today because I'm very excited about each of them and each of our speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Yasheng Huang, who is Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT's Sloan School of Management. From 2013 to 2017, he served as Associate Dean in charge of MIT Sloan's Global Partnership Programs and its Action Learning Initiatives. His previous appointments include faculty positions at the University of Michigan and at Harvard Business School. Professor Huang is author of 12 books, I believe now, yes? I had to update it from last time I introduced you to something when it was 11. He's very prolific. These books are in both English and Chinese, and many academic papers and news commentaries. His books, Statism with Chinese Characteristics, Cambridge University Press, and The Rise and Fall of the East, Examination, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology in Chinese History and Today, Yale University Press, will be published in 2023. He is co-principal investigator in a large-scale multidisciplinary research project on food safety in China. Professor Huang founded and runs China Lab and India Lab, which have provided low-cost consulting services to hundreds of small and medium enterprises in China and India. From 2015 to 2018, he ran a program in Yunnan province to train women entrepreneurs, funded by Goldman Sachs Foundation. So without further ado, I will welcome Professor Huang for his opening address. Pull your slides up now. thing is you'll have to use the arrow keys to advance.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Go to that screen right there, and there should be a menu. It says display settings, and you have to swap.
There we go.
Okay?
All right, thank you.
You got it. You have to do that with the shot.
Thank you, David, for inviting me to this conference. I was very interested to learn about the entrepreneurship and innovation themes of this program. And the India Lab and China Lab that David mentioned are also about, not so much about innovation, but about entrepreneurship. And we have worked with over 300 small and medium enterprises in China and India. And this year, we have created a new course on ASEAN countries. These are Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and focusing on enterprise development in those regions. And it has been a tremendous experience for our students to learn about entrepreneurship in the context of developing economies and observing very close to action how entrepreneurs deal with challenges in their home environments. So what I teach is also consistent with the objectives of your program. So I'm going to talk about something else entirely, about U.S.-China relations in the age of uncertainty. And I apologize for the fact that my session is probably the least legally informed and informative, so I apologize for that. But I think to focus on these macro political economic shocks in this day and age is very important. And I really truly believe that we're entering into an age of uncertainty. There are rising macro meta threats, familiar ones, global warming, and even within the United States, rising threats to democracy, geopolitical instability, and this is more on the economic side, deglobalization, and the dramatic rearrangement of global supply chains. One motivation for us to create the ASEAN Lab is that we have observed migration of supply chains out of China into Southeast Asian countries, and they need advice on how to set up their factories, how to set up their customer relations. So we work with the entrepreneurs to do that. Global pandemic, instability due to power transition, right? So there's a famous idea, Thucydides' trap, which says that when major powers are changing in terms of their balance of power, that's the era of instability. And the looming potential crisis over Taiwan Strait, and rising tensions between U.S. and China. You know, as we speak, the Biden administration just unveiled some of the most stringent export controls vis-a-vis semiconductor to China. And that has implications for people in the legal profession. And I would argue that U.S.-China relations are the linchpin of many of the bullet points that I described in the previous slide. China could play a broker role. It chooses so far not to in the Ukraine conflict. China is the only major country, along with India, that has not actively condemned Russia. China has huge leverage, economic leverage over Russia. The size of the Russian economy is smaller than Italy, and it is smaller than one of the provinces in China, Guangdong province. China is a major player in global warming, both as a source of problem as well as a potential source of solution. And China is a major determinant of the future global economic order, major player, major shaper, and major impact on global economic order, right? The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions. And I would argue that good U.S.-China relations would lead to peace and stability across Taiwan Strait. So you could argue that Taiwan Strait problems are a result of deteriorating U.S.-China relations. You know, obviously the causal direction can run in the opposite direction, which is that the Taiwan Strait is a cause for the tensions between U.S. and China. But one can plausibly argue that if U.S. and China have good relationship, the Taiwan Strait issue will be minimized. So my focus is going to be on U.S.-China relations rather than about these other things. But that relationship is a centerpiece of many other issues going on in the world. So let me start with the fundamentals of the U.S.-China relations. And we can sort of divide fundamentals into the economic fundamentals and political fundamentals. And I would argue that there are many good, positive economic fundamentals between the two countries. Right? For example, in terms of innovation vis-a-vis applications, they are complementary with each other. Right? U.S. is very famously innovative, and China is famously capable of applying technologies and scaling technology. So when the technology comes from a university lab, it has no commercial value. It has to be prototyped. It has to be scaled. It has to be commercialized. And China has been very good in prototyping and scaling. And if you look at government spending on R&D, the two countries are actually very complementary in terms of the structure of the government spending on R&D. China spends a lot of money across the board among many, many disciplines. U.S. government spending is focused on basically two areas. The government spending is actually focused on one area, life science, right? Because politicians want to live long. They don't want to cut spending on other, they don't want to cut spending on life science. But if you look at spending on physical sciences, material sciences, right? In the 1980s, the government spending on life science compared with the government spending on material science, the ratio is about 1:1. Today it's about 3:1. Right? So U.S. is very concentrated in one area, whereas China spends across the board. So you might argue that the good thing for the universities to do in the U.S. is to get funding from China to fund those areas that are not being funded by the U.S. government. In terms of academic collaborations, and one reason for why academic collaborations were so productive between U.S. and China is because of that dynamic. And in my forthcoming book, I argue that the two countries have very, very different academic system. Republic of Government, which is very good at scaling because the government there is very effective. And the other is Republic of Science, which is that the scientists are the decision makers, and they decide on their research agenda. But the results of that have to be scaled, has to be prototyped, and China is good at that. In terms of the doing research, doing science is both capital intensive and labor intensive, right? So there's a study of increasing the speed of the chips. In the 1970s, you need like, gave some arbitrary numbers, like 10 technicians, but now you need 102, right, 120. So it's massively labor intensive. And China has so many excellent students who can not only do science, but also can work in the laboratories and as postdocs, as research assistants. Science is built on not just a few Nobel Prize winners, but on this massive army of technicians. In terms of production, right, China has an incredible cluster of manufacturing facilities, right? And it is because of low cost, for sure, right? Because China's GDP per capita is about 1/4 of the US GDP per capita. But it's also because of clustering, right? So what economists call the clustering economics. Essentially, you have so many enterprises concentrated in a small region of the country, so the costs are very, very low because of that clustering. Whereas the US has research clusters, right? So if you look at life science, it's basically Kendall Square now, software, Silicon Valley, but the US has lost its manufacturing clusters. What went wrong? There are many bad and deteriorating political fundamentals, right? And I would argue that, so my presentation is focused more on the US side rather than on the Chinese side, and there is plenty to blame on the Chinese side, so I'm not excusing the Chinese responsibility for that, but because my lecture is short, so I'm only going to focus on one country. I believe that the US has not addressed these political fundamentals, or begin to address these things too late. If you go back to 1990s, the original rationale for incorporating China into the global economic order, the WTO, the most favored nation trading status, they were justified on political grounds. And this is very interesting. If you go to a university, a seminar on trade, people talk about comparative advantage, absolute advantage. But if you go to a politician's discussions and lectures on trade, they usually talk about politics, right? That's how President Clinton talked about why China should be a member of the WTO. It was to change Chinese politics. Right? I mean, he mentioned economics, but mostly he emphasized politics. So the rationale was on politics, but the tactic has been completely about economics. There has not been a very explicit political, so I use a strategy, but maybe strategy is not the right word, tactic, right? So there has not been a political tactic accompanying that economic strategy. So I'm going to give some examples. The political strategy consists of slogans, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, right? Very, very grandiose aspirations, rather than kind of problem-driven, issue-by-issue solutions to political problems. And I believe that the U.S. has ignored the small things in pursuit of these grand, unrealistic objectives. So let me give some examples, and I believe that the best strategy or best tactic ought to be a tit for tat, right? Principle of symmetry. You do A, I do A, and then I will see if you do A. If you don't do A, then I don't do A, right? So that ought to be the guiding principle. But that principle has not been applied. For example, I was born in China, raised in China, and I'm a beneficiary of that lack of symmetry. Chinese students and scholars are welcomed on U.S. Campus, but China places many, many restrictions on the ability of the U.S. academics to organize events, to organize institutions and organizations in China. There ought to be symmetry, right? So we also have demanded unfettered access by U.S. academics to China in exchange for the same unfettered access by the Chinese to the American campus. In terms of media, right? I don't know about Boston College. On MIT campus, sometimes I pick up a copy of China Daily, free of charge. And but New York Times is banned in China. Google is banned in China. I use Baidu all the time. I can have free access to Baidu, right? There ought to be symmetry, right? So, and this is not violating anything, right? Because I'm allowing China Daily. You ought to allow New York Times. For years and years, U.S. didn't take up on these things. In terms of business, give one example. Alibaba Cloud computing service is free to operate in the United States. Right? There are not many customers because nobody trusts them. But in terms of the legal operation, they are free to operate. Right? Whereas Google Cloud and Amazon Cloud cannot operate in China without very stringent equity restrictions and legal restrictions. So there's a famous book by Robert Axelrod. It's called The Evolution of Cooperation. And through computer simulations, it shows that the best strategy is a tit for tat, right? You first do A to see if the other side does A, and then if the other side does A, you reciprocate, right? Or you take it away if the other side doesn't do it. Instead, we have too many grand strategies and too few fixes, right? The prevailing narratives on China is long game, the Thucydides trap, a full spectrum competitor, the 100-year marathon strategic competitor, right? I would argue that we should adopt a problem-based, issue-by-issue approach, rather than trying to agree on this grand infrastructure, grand architecture of the relationship, and focus on problems in front of us, right? We should seek symmetry. We should pivot away from sort of a China-specific approach, and we should start hard conversations with humility and mutually acceptable terms on issues such as human rights, and invest in our knowledge base about China. Let me quickly go through some of these bullet points. President Biden's recent decision on the Public Accounting Oversight Board is an excellent decision, excellent development. So for those of you who don't know, the PCAOB requires companies who list on the U.S. Stock Exchange to allow this body to audit the books of the auditing firms that audit their books. This is universally required, not only of Chinese companies, but of all the foreign companies, as well as U.S. companies. When the law was passed in, I think it's 2012 or 2013, for 10 years, China didn't observe that, and U.S. let it go. And I'm sure it was the Wall Street that was behind the inaction by the U.S. government, because Wall Street was making a lot of money listing Chinese firms on the U.S. stock market. And now the Biden administration says, no, you have to agree with that compliance. If not, then you have to be delisted. And Chinese government has agreed, at least tentatively, to enforcement. CFIUS is now is instructed to restrict Chinese investments. Now I would argue that the scrutiny of CFIUS should be made contingent on how Chinese government treats U.S. investments, right? So CFIUS now is only looking at national security implications of Chinese investments. They should take into account how the home countries treat the US companies in order to determine the level of the scrutiny. Right? There are many parameters to consider, right? Investor protection, IP, right? Regulatory transparency, data sovereignty, national security restriction, etc., right? So let me quickly end on human rights. I don't think U.S. should give up on human rights, right? Some people argue, oh, this is, just international relations. We shouldn't care about human rights. But its engagement should be smarter with China on human rights, right? Our dialogue with China should not be, lecturing the Chinese, democracy and kind of value-laden language. I mean, we often talk about universal rights, universal values. The fact is, 74 million Americans in 2020 voted for a transparent authoritarian, right? So the values of democracy are not even national within the United States, let alone universal. I don't really believe that these values are necessarily universal. They ought to be based on pragmatic argument for democracy, performance. And there's a lot of research that shows that democracy actually delivers performance, right? Darren Acemoglu, one of the most famous economists in the world, MIT professor, has done excellent research on this topic. And I have argued before that we ought to choose our language carefully when we talk about democracy and human rights in a way that is resonant with the Chinese public, rather than kind of, just using the Western discourse. And we should invest in our knowledge base. What is very interesting now is that as the importance of China is now so obvious, our investments in the knowledge base about the country has actually decreased. The U.S. funding of social science has sharply decreased, right? We complain about U.S. underinvestments in technology and science. U.S. has systematically underinvested in social science. If you try to apply for funding from the National Science Foundation to do social science projects, other than kind of small number of economic topics and topics closely related to the U.S., there's no prayer of hope that you get funded by National Science Foundation. And then there are other things like social science, emphasis on discipline, and which is impeding discovery of knowledge. And U.S. government today has very little real knowledge about China. And when I talk to government people about this, they actually acknowledge that. And what they say is that some people will say, other people will not say that. But some people will say, we don't care. All we care is what Xi Jinping says, and we don't care about Chinese economy, Chinese society. I argue that that's not really a good policy approach. Let me end there, and thank you so much, and good luck to a very, very good conference. Thank you.
Setting the scene for that. We're going to start our next panel promptly at 9:20, so that's going to be on global tech trends. So if you want to freshen up your coffee or stretch your legs, that's fine, and our panelists can come up and we'll set up for our next panel.
Yeah.